Hey, Cynthia, hi.
Now I can say it's so nice to see all of you. The technology is defeating us, you know. I never know what headphone is going to work, and I don't really know what my computer is going to do at any given moment. But I'm sure everyone is suffering to some degree with that.
We are all similarly afflicted. Yeah.
Exactly.
I just am still so grateful that we have this technology, because I think about what would have happened 20, 30 years ago.
I tell you, I mean, when I joined this business in the late medieval era, you know, in the late 70s, I mean, this would have been unthinkable. I mean, you know, business would not have been able to operate at all in those days if there'd just been this kind of lockdown at home. People wouldn't have been able to communicate much. Unless they had in their bedrooms. I mean, obviously they could communicate by phone, but this degree of interaction and connectivity would have been impossible. So,
you know what would be interesting is if anybody does a comparison between the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 and the 2020 pandemic, and just see how life was different in each. I mean, ships still sailed, commerce still happened, but just to see how the impacts were different.
Yeah, well, they say that the Spanish flu killed more people than World War I. I mean, by a substantial margin.
Well, I think they are saying that this pandemic killed more Americans than any of our wars.
Oh, certainly. Yeah.
So, but we're on the upswing. We're on the backside of it. We're going to.
Yes, we are.
We're going to move forward, and I have to say, yes, it's been an incredible tragedy with the deaths and the, you know, just the writhing of global economy. But I'm also proud of our industry. I think we still have a lot of work to do in terms of how we're treating the mariners and getting the mariners vaccinated, so that and addressing mental health issues that are an outcropping of the pandemic, but also we're beginning to be identified before the pandemic. So I think we still have a lot of ways to go, but I'm proud of the industry and the fact that it forged forward and continued delivering the goods and energy that the world desperately needed. Can you imagine if shipping stopped on top of everything else?
Yes.
But I do think I'm preaching to the choir.
You are.
Just a bit of good news. National Guard has now started, they've offered to give vaccines to shipboard staff as well. So, you know, there are many US ports where they were giving vaccines to seafarers visiting ships. And now the National Guard has also, they've put up teams to address that. So that momentum should pick up. So it's good for the seafarers visiting US, foreign seafarers on foreign flagships.
No, and I think it's fantastic that we can do that, since they're the however you want to refer to the coverage, bad, biased, or otherwise, in terms of the U.S. swimming in vaccinations while the rest of the world struggles and fights and suffers to get a vaccination rate that approaches ours. I think it's fantastic that we can do that for the people who happen to be visiting. It's kind of a tremendous opportunity, I think, for the U.S. to shine for the rest of the world.
So true.
And long overdue. So it looks like it is 10:02. I will defer to Carlene. Do you think we should kick this off, or give people a few more minutes? Or
as always, I defer to, well, I'm going to kick it off with the technical housekeeping, which is something that is become rote. For those who are joining us today, thank you very much for joining. We're just going to remind you that while all the speakers will keep their videos on, we ask that if you are not a speaker, that you keep your video and your microphone on. And those of you who are speakers who are not speaking, if you could mute your microphones as well. We will be running through the program, starting with Joe and Paul, and then we'll get into our presenters. And we just want to thank you all for joining us, and particularly thank you for your interest in the topic. So without further ado, I will give you to Joe Hughes. Oh, and one other thing I do have to mention by law is that this is being recorded. So if you haven't, just recognize it's being recorded, and I hope you don't have an issue with that. And it will be posted on demand, probably both through CMA and the NAMEPA websites. So without further ado, here is our
So he is.
Our chairman, Joe Hughes.
Well, so indeed it is, and that may in fact be a picture that was taken some years ago. Those that wish me ill might actually suggest that, but it wasn't. Yes, I really do look like that, ladies and gentlemen. But to endorse what Carly just said, we're delighted to have you with us today. Thank you very much indeed for your interest in this most important subject. It's a particular pleasure, I think, for NAMEPA to be participating with the Connecticut Maritime Association in this program. We are both Connecticut-based, which is I think significant. And as all Connecticuters know, the motto of our state of Connecticut in Latin is qui transtulit sustinet, which means, as all those Connecticuters who've had the benefit of classical education will tell you, he who has moved across sustains. So the very earliest settlers in Connecticut understood the value of sustainability. And it's therefore very appropriate that it should be Connecticut institutions that are co-sponsoring this today. ESG, of course, is very much the calibration these days, not just in relation to maritime activity, but generally across industry, business, government, if you will, as a whole, of what sustainability entails. Calibrated to environmental concerns, social concerns, and the concerns of governance. Much of this, of course, stems from the Sustainable Development Goals, which were developed by the United Nations in 2015 and have become the background, the backdrop, the theme in relation to which ESG has developed in more recent years. It's vitally important, I think, and the driving force of ESG makes this very clear, that all of us involved in the maritime industry take this seriously into account. And when I refer to the maritime industry, I mean not only the operators of ships, but also, of course, those that provide finance with the Poseidon Principles, those who charter ships with the Sea Charter, Sea Cargo initiatives, and so on. And indeed, as a marine insurer, in the P&I club context, ESG has become increasingly important to us too, in a rather traditional and rather conservative area of maritime enterprise. And in fact, there is now within the international group, and has been for the past couple of years, a sustainability subcommittee in which representatives of most of the international group clubs are actually dealing with issues of sustainability related to ESG as part of the profile that the group has and what it must regard as important for its mission today and over the years ahead. So there's never been a more apposite time, I think, to actually address the issues of ESG as it applies to maritime affairs than at present. And I'm delighted to see that we have an outstanding panel who'll be able to share with us their insights into the various areas in which they are engaged. We have Jeff Prybor, a very good friend, who's Chief Financial Officer of International Seaways. We have Captain Anuj Chopra, another very good friend, who's CEO of ESG Plus. There's a concentration of expertise clearly in that area. We have Andrew Baranski, the interim program manager of the United States Merchant Marine Academy, a very august institution that produces a lot of people actually who work in our industry, not just here, but elsewhere. And also, I'm pleased to say, within the American club's operating management. And last but by no means least, looking at it from a a cyber risk perspective, we have another extremely good friend, Cynthia Hudson, who is CEO of Hudson Cyber. So we have a very broad range of different parts of our industry looking at this most important subject. And I'm sure that all of us will find those insights that they will impart to us and share with us today to be very interesting indeed. Paul, can I hand over to you now? Paul Mezzarelli, who is the Baltic Exchange representative here, very august, even more august, arguably, than anything that there is in the shipping industry. I'm very familiar with the Baltic, having walked past it many, many times over my years working in London, and still when I go back there, and it's quite an institution. And he is also the chair of the Connecticut Maritime Association Board Communications Committee. So, Paul, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate that, Joe. So, yeah, this is probably one of the most timely presentations that I think NAMEPA and the CMA have ever managed to put together. And just reading the news, it's almost impossible to keep up with what's going on. It seems like we're at a stage now where every day something is eclipsing whatever was the prior ESG related headline. And we've, I think, really managed to hit the nail on the head with the timing here. And again, thank you to Carleen for her initiative in putting this together and for the opportunity to work with you. We're at a stage now where the shipping industry in particular is, if not directly under more challenges, we are tangentially under more challenges than we've ever seen. If you look at the pace of change and of regulation, think back 25 odd years ago when Open 90 passed after the Exxon Valdez disaster, people were still speculating a couple of years prior to the implementation whether or not this whole double hull concept was actually going to be enforced. Then we had a couple of decades of relative quiet, and then suddenly it was the IMO 2020 fuel implementation of the new standards. And in between those two, there were all the security concerns that came after the 2001 terror attacks. So it just seems like the frequency of regulatory events and of things that are hitting us, the frequency is increasing and the severity is strengthening in terms of what this means for the operation. It's a dramatic change that we have to deal with, but also the speed of the impact of this. I think it's probably safe to say 2 weeks ago, nobody had ever heard of a company called Engine Number One, and now suddenly they're controlling 3 seats on Exxon's board. Roughly a year after Exxon was displaced from the Dow 30 index, the Dow Jones index, to be replaced by Salesforce.com. We've seen Shell divest of a couple of major assets in the Gulf Coast region. Again, I think that's the result of some shareholder pressure. So here we are now with the maritime industry, and obviously we serve and are served by the energy industry on a daily basis. So we've got a great panel here, and I've been collecting some questions from friends and colleagues over the weekend and the last couple of days to address some of these, but I'm looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to say and what our group has to offer in terms of this insight in this, for better or worse, very exciting time. So I will hand it back to Carleen and let us get it started.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Paul and Joe, for opening this event. And again, NAMEPA is honored to be partnering with the CMA on such an important topic. I just want to give a little bit of a background on NAMEPA's involvement. NAMEPA was launched over 14 years ago. And when we first got underway, we were nicknamed Salty Tree Huggers, although it would have been more appropriate to have said Salty Seaweed Huggers. One organization even stated their membership wasn't interested in the marine environment. We started with 33 members, and now we number over 200. And while our catchment area is Canada, the United States, Mexico, and the Caribbean, our reach extends globally as companies trading to North America also embrace our message to save our seas. But what a difference 14 years makes. In the past 5 years, we have seen the maritime industry embrace the principles of sustainability, which led NAMEPA to develop our CSR ESG Maritime Sustainability Passport to support the industry as it navigates towards mitigating its impacts on the environment, as well as make improvements to its social and governance platforms. Whatever the drivers, the maritime industry is committed to sustainability and is demonstrating that through its approach to ESG. We're going to learn more about these strategies today through the wisdom and expertise of our 4 speakers, for which we thank them. Leading us off is Jeff Prebar, CFO of International Seaways. Jeff himself is a sailor and therefore no stranger to the relationship with the sea. The CEO of International Seaways is Lois Zabrocki, a mariner and graduate of Kings Point. So today we're going to learn from Jeff how their leadership has translated to International Seaways ESG program. Jeff, take it away.
Thank you, Carly, as I come off mute. It's a pleasure to be here. Lois and I and all of Seaways are big believers in the topic for today, as I was saying to the other speakers before we got started. We're also big proponents of NAMEPA and CMA, so we are just delighted to be asked to speak today. And Lois sends her best. She would have been herself, but she's started a little business travel already. So the opening is back, right? And so she's out of town. So I'm happy to cover for it and talk about one of my favorite topics, at least to introduce it. And if we could go to the next slide, Cecilia. The next real slide after the disclaimer. Yeah, go to the next one. I think everyone knows International Seaways, but just to take 2 minutes of my 12. We were spun off from OSG in 2016. Time flies. I can't believe it's been coming up on 5 years since we became an independent company involved in international tanker shipping, clearly. As I think you all know, but also the FSO business and the lighting business. So this on this page is our current fleet, but as it also says, kind of like the old saying of when you started school after Labor Day and told the teacher what did I do during my summer vacation? What do we do during pandemic? Well, clearly it was a crazy time for tankers, crazy good, crazy bad, negative oil price, total stories galore. But through all that, we managed to get done 2 very significant transactions. The first was the announcement, come back to this because it has me a 3 component of 3 new building contracts, assuming 3 new building contracts initiated by Shell. We'll finish the building of these dual fuel, meaning LNG fuel and very low sulfur fuel oil, VLCCs at the DSME yard in Korea, and then we'll go to a 7-year time charter with Shell, which is very exciting. And the second thing we did during the pandemic was to announce a merger with one of our fellow New York area, Connecticut based tanker shipping companies that you all know, Diamond, which was going to create a much larger company. To see you next slide. And just to finish on us before we go into Seaways and ESG, this just gives you a snapshot of what the 2 companies coming together looks like. We're looking at a total, if we look on the right hand side, 100 vessels, which makes us the number 2 listed tanker company in units and 11.7 million deadweight tons, so number 3 deadweight tons. So, quite the presence for New York, Connecticut, NYMAR, NAMEPA, CMA, all. Let's think of us all in the New York metropolitan area, inclusive of Connecticut. What's exciting in that regard, and we will have just about $1 billion in market cap. If you add the 2 up today, it's just under that. But I think we'll expect to pass $1 billion market cap as the recovery evidence comes along. So exciting to have the 2 companies put together. Now, if we could go to the next slide. This is detailed our strategy with respect to ESG and mentions at the very top that we put together our first ESG report for the year 2019. Unfortunately, this was COVID affected. It didn't really come out until kind of the end of 2020, but we'll intend to have the next report for 2020 out by around mid-year this year. But so we're very proud to have that done. It lists our strategy, environmental, social, governance, all is listed on this page. But I thought what might be a little more interesting for this group rather than just walking through our ESG report, which you can all read, is to tell you some of how ESG or our approach at International Seaways to ESG evolved over time. That might be a little bit more interesting than just running through all the principles. So for me, it goes back to our early days. Our first full year of existence after the spinoff was 2017. And I well remember having a summer intern. She was a young woman who was a junior, rising senior, I think, at Darien High School, and a terrifically energetic person. I said, go find out what the state of the art is in terms of description of sustainability, green, the UN sustainable goals, as Joe said, had just been out a couple of years. Tree hugging, whatever you want to call it, like Carlene, I'm with you. Those were all terms being used, but it wasn't very clear. It wasn't ESG yet. So you didn't see that in all the literature in 2017. It was just coming into being. And so I think our major accomplishment for 2017 was quote unquote discovering ESG. And started with the 17-year-old intern who helped me realize that CSR was not probably the state of the art of the way to look at this. Names matter. The nomenclature around ESG, the environmental, the social, the governance, it really pulls it all together. We knew that we had a culture of good governance and of course seafarers, safety and well-being first. That always was part of OSG, and certainly has been with Lois and everyone else at INSW have stood for from the beginning, and commitment to the environment. But it was only 2017 where we realized that the way to frame that and to drive a strategy forward was by waiving the ESG. So that was milestone number one, discovering ESG. In 2018, I'd say that's the year we really, INS really woke up, because that's the first time we ever heard the term woke. It's really good to have kids or interns who can teach you new words like woke, but we didn't know, but we realized we needed to become a little more woke, starting at ESG, and we worked towards that in 2018. We started a program called Get to Green. That is what was and is, but still ongoing, focused on fuel efficiency in our fleet, bringing down consumption of fuel, but with the goal of getting greener, less CO2 emission, not just saving money. And it was pitched to our seafarers as, hey, let's get competitive, make your ship the best, and you will be not just save money for the people at an office tower in New York and our shareholders, but you will do well for the environment if you win this competition. And in the first year, our overall fleet saved 8,000 tons of fuel, 1,000 tons of CO2 emissions. So this was a next milestone for us in ESG. If we look at 2019, in March of 2019, we published our 2018 annual report, and that was really significant to me because it was the first time we put in a public filing our commitment to ESG, spelled out environmental, social, governance principles, explained what it was, and explicitly said that we are committed to ESG principles, and modified our strategy, which had started like many public companies with, we want to maximize shareholder value, and we still want to maximize shareholder value. But in 2019, we explicitly made clear that we wanted to maximize shareholder value only if consistent with our ESG principles. And maybe a small step, but I think that was a really critical and really important for us as a public company to take that step and commit ourselves in our filings, as we do now every quarter and every year and every proxy statement. In 2020, the next milestone for us was the sustainability-linked loan. We have, I think, the first 5 sustainability-linked loans. I feel like everybody's had the first one, but that's okay. We like to share good ideas. I do think that in terms of a bank loan in the shipping industry, we may be we're the first one, and kudos to our bank group, which was very supportive of this idea. It involved embracing the Poseidon principles, which we've all heard about, and saying we will report our CO2 emissions, But more importantly, we will report on progress along the trajectory to the 2040, 2050 CO2 reduction goals. And if we are on that line, or downward sloping line, or below it, meaning better, we will get a little bit lower interest mark. And equally important, if we are a little bit above it, or any amount above it, we'll pay a little bit more amount. Not huge amounts, but real money. And that's an important principle that we now see in a lot of loans. And I would also, as many will have noticed, sustainability bonds. Green bonds have been around for a while, but we've seen more sustainable bonds with shipping. For example, Oddfell, CFAN have both done this, where the ultimate rate is either tied to a trajectory, such as in our bank deal, or the expenditure of a certain amount of funds on the sustainability or ESG related CapEx. So this kind of financing has become common, but that was another milestone for us. Next, in 2021, I'd say the milestone for us is embracing the energy transition. I mentioned the Shell dual fuel LNG new builds at the beginning. I can't tell you how excited I am for us to be involved with this. Lois and I were saying publicly, long before we ever could dream this deal might come around, that the way forward for the next part of the shipping evolution with respect to the environment, is the E part of ESG, was going to be collaboration with major customers, because the cost of new building a dual fuel engine, for example, 15% more, or 13 to 15% more than conventional fueling. How do you do that on a speculative basis? It's too risky, but if you do it in collaboration with the customer, then it's win-win. And that's exactly what happened with Shell, a longtime customer of ours, dedicated to LNG as a transitional fuel. Everyone knows it's transition, it's not the forever answer. But Shell feel, and we feel, that LNG is a key part of the next 10 years at least, and when we find the next propulsion method, we'll be on board with ammonia, hydrogen, whatever it is, in the 2030s or even sooner maybe. But even then, I'm sure LNG will have a place. And the key is to get going, be in the game, not to be on the sidelines and get participating. And so we're super proud that we have started with the fuel inputs. And lastly, and I'm coming up close to my 12 minutes, so I'll try to say pretty close to on time. What next? What goes even beyond a transition? Well, this harkens back to the comments that Paul was making about the momentous things going on in the energy field today in the last couple of weeks. It emphasizes that a company in shipping like ourselves, especially in tanker shipping, has to think like every company does about whether they're in trucking or aviation or manufacturing, about how you do what you do and how you do that with less emissions. That's the key of propulsion, et cetera. But there'll be an element as we go forward out beyond 2030 of not just how we do what we do, but what do we do? You know, we are a tanker company, we transport cargo. You know, how is that going to evolve in line with the changing eventual, and maybe sooner than later, peak demand for oil? But then there'll be gas for that. But then everything will start to decline. How, as a public company, do we do that? You know, you see companies being asked to divest, like Paul mentioned, sell divest in some assets, but they just go from a public company to a private company. Does that really change anything? And so, how do you operate as a public company, not just reducing the CO2 and other greenhouse gases and performing up and we're dedicated to other ESG principles, but looking out 10 years and longer on what's the future going to be? I don't have the answer. All I can tell you that Lois and I spend a lot of time thinking on it and looking forward to that future when we're a bit closer to net neutral carbon. So thank you, for Carlene, for mentioning that as a sailor. If I finish my remarks, I'll put it in sailing terms. You know, we're headed to that first mark, you know, which is a transition. The first leg of the race is the energy transition period. And you know, you can't sail straight to the first mark, except with dead upwind. So first we had to go on port tack, and to me, that's INSW merging with IMS and getting scale. 100 ships, 12 million deadweight tons, $1 billion in market cap. That's the scale that we'll have we'll need to have the ability to innovate internally and collaborate with our customers. Then we'll tack to starboard, and that means the dual fuel. The 3 that we've got, maybe more gas projects to come. Who knows? That's going to be another way that we change that first mark. And then we'll get to the windward mark, make the rounding, and who knows if we'll be powered by hydrogen, ammonia, biofuel, whatever it is. But we'll be sailing full speed ahead towards the carbon neutral world after that. So that's a little bit of INSW's view towards ESG, and I'll be glad to turn it back over to Carleen for our next speaker.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Jeff, and thanks for the analogy to sailing. Quick question for you. What would you say was the most difficult yet important cultural shift in your pathway to adopting ESG practices?
I would say, fortunately, the governance side was easy because we had a diverse board and management suite from the beginning, with Lois as at our head and on our board, also with Randy Day. So we have a good diverse board and a commitment there to good governance and transparency. So we've always won the Weber Award, as well as part of it for that for #1 governance in tanker shipping. And we're looking forward to the NAMEPA passport validation, by the way, it's time. And we have Mark, our summer intern from Connecticut Maritime, is on the call today. So Mark, your next assignment is to get us to work with Carleen's group to get the NAMEPA passport. So that's our next goal.
Excellent.
So having said that, I'll say the only thing that was challenging, I think, if you have people feel like, oh, aren't we supposed to always go for the best financial result? Don't we have a fiduciary duty to do that? For example, recycling. Are we allowed, as a public company, to take a little bit less in proceeds to do a Hong Kong recycling, which we state clearly in our ESG report we're committed to? The answer is yes, you can. You can. That is, it is okay to do that. But I think it took a little while to get people used to sort of the double bottom line, triple bottom line concept, and frankly that you can do well by doing good. Following ESG principles is not only the right thing to do, and we know it's the right thing to do, but it is going to make a difference and make our company a more successful company in every definition of success by that. And that I think took a little while to understand, but we have complete buy-in on that at our company.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. We really appreciated the insight into your approach to ESG and how it's being managed and encouraged. So thank you for that. And we look forward to you coming into the process of our Maritime Sustainability Passport. Next, we're going to hear from Captain Anuj Chopra. Anuj is a former ship's master. He was president of Anglo-Eastern Ship Management for the United States and then vice president of RightShip. So his career has embraced every aspect of ESG, leading him to found ESG Plus, where he is the chief executive officer. And he's also on the executive board of NAMEPA. So Anuj, what do we need to know about ESG?
Thank you, Carleen. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you, Joe, and very grateful to NAMEPA and CMA for this opportunity. I'm hoping to delve into a little bit on ESG, CSR side of it, and try to go from the basics and build it up. And what is the NAMEPA's ESG program, the CSR, the Corporate Social Responsibility Program? What does it really mean? Next slide. So what's driving ESG? Yes, we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but it's these children. These are the ones who hold the future for us. We have to hand over our world to them tomorrow. They are the leaders of tomorrow. And they are the ones who are holding us accountable today. So whatever we're doing for ESG is that we are handing it over to them, at least, hopefully better, but at least in the same state, not in a more degraded state. Global village, as one would say. Next slide, please. So what is corporate social responsibility? Just trying to look into the basics of it. What does it have impact on the company and on society? It's about operations. It's about the value chain created, as Jeff nicely explained. Who all does it apply to? Is it only suppliers? It's only customers? It's only stakeholders? Or it's society as well? Environmental emissions and impacts is important. And so is the philanthropic program to allow for that development to happen, for the next big thing, for the next disruptor. Focus on responsibility in 4 specific areas. And Jeff, I think, gave it very well in the financial and corporate governance side of it. There is the environmental and emission side of it. There is a human element side of it. And when we talk about shipping and seafarers in the maritime supply chain, it's the wellness of seafarers, it's the welfare of seafarers. Of course, in addition to the shore staff as well. And then there is social license and societal demand. We heard that example of engine number 1, what happened in that week, 1 week, which sort of changed things for the biggest energy companies in the world. So we'll come back to that and call it, different words for different people, but all of them are listed there for you. Next slide, please. So what is environmental, social, and governance mean if we try to put it very simply? It's a framework for assessing the impact of sustainability as a whole and the ethical process of a company on its financial performance and operations, how that impacts society, how that impacts all the stakeholders, the employees, the subcontractors, and within the company. And no hesitation in saying that International Seaways is a very good example how they have implemented this. Next slide, please. So specifically when we are looking to maritime, what are we looking at in the ESG space? Today, it's turning out to be a customer requirement. The users of shipping as a service are demanding it, that they would like ESG companies. They give preference to ESG companies because they have goals in that space. There is a fiduciary reporting requirement, and increasingly this is becoming mandatory. Of course, it's sort of mandatory for listed companies, but even for non-listed companies, there is a strong demand for it and likely to come up. This deals with the industry's best practices. It doesn't go with the minimum compliance side of it, but it goes with the best practices involved. It is focus of investors. Again, we saw about engine number 1, classic example. It is a society's demand. It is a social demand today. It gives a social license for a company to operate. And perhaps most important, it is the right thing to do for us. The best part of it is profitable. It actually, it's got a direct relationship to the bottom line, to the money we make. And to do all this, you've got to measure to manage the ESG side of it. Thank you. Next slide. So going back history, we were having a good discussion among the NAMEPA team, and we said, how long ago was ESG there? And you will be surprised. The idea of doing well by doing good goes back 3,500 years. And if you Google Investopedia, it came under the term of socially responsible investing. So it has been through the ages. It's been in different forms as society presented challenges at that time, but it was addressed and it had a special space in that. Next slide, please. Sorry, I don't think you can read this. It's a lot of data, but to highlight the fact that we had, as far as 1898, we had a specific requirement on socially responsible investing. 1928, the first fund, specifically called the Pioneer Fund, was based on ESG principles in that space. And then it goes on, and interestingly, in 2014, UN Principles for Responsible Investing assets under management by signatories reached $45 trillion. So there has been a lot of commitment, and The governance teams, the management teams have realized the importance of ESG CSR throughout the ages. So it's not a new concept. We just are putting it into a new form, adapting it to our society as of today. Next slide, please. So what is driving the evolution of ESG CSR? Where's this demand coming from? Very rightly said, it is the word of today. There's an increased focus on this at this time. It's demanded by regulators, by customers, by stakeholders, by society. Everybody's asking for it. Media has played a very important part, and I'm going to show you some slides, some clippings, which would highlight that fact to you. It is a competitive advantage. The smart companies are using it, implementing it, adapting it, embracing it, and using it as a competitive advantage to increase their profitability and return on investment. So it's got a win-win-win on all three sides of it. Next slide, please. So this is a bunch of clippings we're going to go. What better place than to start on World Ocean Day with a beautiful view of the ocean. Next click, please. So this is a question which was recently asked, and I'm sure you're aware, at least half of what our oxygen, what we breathe, comes from the oceans. There is some estimation that this may be 80%. So it's somewhere between 50 and 80%. Next click, please. See that, turn ESG reporting into your best asset. There's a positive spin supporting from the industry, from the media, encouraging industry to work on that. Next click, please. Imagine the definition of a corporation has been changed. It went an economy that serves all Americans. This is the Business Roundtable where they redefined it in 2019. We've got, as early this year, a step towards making your company more sustainable. It tries to address all these factors. And Reuters themselves came up with the ESG Investment North American report, a very detailed report in that space. So as correctly said earlier by Jeff, every aspect of society, every business entity is looking at ESG and embracing and trying to adopt it because there is a benefit to them. Next click, please. Many of you would have heard of Larry Fink. He's the CEO of BlackRock. And they have assets, I thought, of close to $9 trillion where I checked. That's larger than most economies in the world. So in his letter, which he produces in January every year, he's made it very clear to his CEOs where they have interests that just by making money is not enough. You've got to engage stakeholders and serve society. All that is there. It's worth listening to his podcast. If you have the chance, encourage you to do that. And of course, as recent as 30th of April, CNBC reported that there's no hotter area in Wall Street than ESG, sustainably focused funds, which are nearing $2 trillion at this time. I'm sure they're exceeding it as of today. Next slide, please. There is a regulatory pressure as well. Europe is going to make sustainability reporting for every registered company over a certain size, and they want to implement that within 18 months. And then it gets stronger where there are issues where society is asking, first informing that their shipping is taking care of 90%, but at the same time, they are demanding some love or hate from shipping. So there's a very strong public opinion sitting there. And greenwashing is increasingly not being acceptable. It's not, so ESG is not marketing. It is at the core of a company, as we will see as we go ahead. Next click, please. The rhetoric actually gets stronger. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at this Harvard report. I fell off the chair when I read this. I never thought we would see this. What it's really saying is 20% of deaths happening today, which prematurely happening, is related to fossil fuel emissions. So it puts a crosshair very, and you know, it's coming from Harvard. It's a respected, beyond doubt organization where you can't really put a cloud over it. And of course, we said big oil's week a few weeks ago made it a very hot week for at least three of the majors. in that energy space, and from different parts of the world. So it's not an isolated pocket, it's going global. And unfortunately, the rhetoric becomes stronger. Next click, please. I don't know if you've seen this film. It's a YouTube film, came on 30th of April. This was put together by journalists which are not covering maritime. It is controversial. It is strong. It looks only one side of it, but it gives you a perspective as to what are folks non-related to shipping looking at. So it's, I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. It's worth looking at to evaluate for yourself. Next click, please. This was what, last Saturday, in New York Times. And they put IMO in crosshairs. So there is a lot of pressure and perspective being looked at on this by saying, where have we gone wrong? Maybe it's a time for introspection, saying, how can we do this better? Because there is a certain part of society which feels that we might have failed them, or maybe we are not able to convey our message to them, what we have been doing. So it's a good question for all of us. But I thought this gives a good spectrum as to what's out there today. Next slide, please. So let's come to NAMEPA. Our focus has always been preserving the marine environment by promoting sustainable maritime industry best practices and educating the public to save our seas. We look always as the glass half full, and how can we encourage ship owners, maritime related organizations to become better, to excel into the ESG space, and point out the leaders, encourage them, applaud them, congratulate them. You see our current chairman there, our directors there, our executive director and co-founder. We've got children who are there in the beach cleanup, and again, the leaders of tomorrow, and they are the ones who are doing it at their age. And we have our ships, our NAMEPA Secretariat team on board one of the ships right there. So very actively involved in all these. I encourage you to check out NAMEPA's various missions and activities. It's an amazing organization. Thank you. Next slide, please. So what does the NAMEPA's Corporate Social Responsibility ESG program? We've tried to make it simple. We've tried to make it easy to implement, easy to adapt. There's a phase 1, which deals with the overview of the program, gives the guidelines, tries to assess the current status of the applicant, where they are on sustainability and environmental care, looks at the basic. After that review, it goes into the second phase, which is actually the major phase, where internal policies are looked at, procedures are looked at, how are they being implemented, how well are they embraced by governance, by senior management, and even all the way to subcontractors. And what is the commitment to sustainability? Because sustainability, or ESG, is a journey. And successfully completing both of them leads to the Maritime Sustainability Passport awarded by NAMEPA as a recognition of a good citizen, corporate citizen, or a good actor in our society. Next slide, please. These are the 6 pillars of the ESG CSR program. Quickly go through them. Waste management, is it just based on regulatory, or is it best management practices? Emissions, what is a company looking at scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions? How are they dealing with them? Education, right from the board to senior management to subcontractors to the rest of the management team. Technology, how are they adopting and embracing new technology, trying to reduce their footprint? Social, perhaps this slide on the right by Lego, and this is LGBTQ month. So I thought this was so apt to say, how well are they embracing everybody with diversity and inclusion? And last but not the least, governance. Governance is critical, as Jeff said, and that takes us to the governance of this program. Next slide, please. So there's very robust governance in assessing this program. It's transparent, but at the same time, it is very well defined. It has a clear timeline. It is completely confidential. There are 2 independent maritime experts who assess the progress, and they are independent of each other as well, so they don't know who the other assessor is. There is no conflict of interest, that is checked, and they have, each of the assessors has a non-disclosure agreement tied, which is very closely checked and enforced. There is specific and independent feedback to the applicant, asking questions or perhaps giving suggestions where they are on their journey and how they can improve. And last but not least, there's independent scoring. So the scoring is done by the NAMEPA Secretariat, where the maritime experts are not part of. So as much as I'm privileged to be one of the assessors, and I don't know what the score is, where it sits. It's the Secretariat which decides. So it's completely robust, it's independent, and it's very well structured. Next slide, please. So with that, I encourage all of you to sign up for NAMEPA's ESG CSR program. That's the website, check it out. And if you need help in implementing ESG in your company and operational risk, check us out at esgplusllc.com. I would be delighted to help you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And most important, I would like to give a very special thank you to the Secretariat at NAMEPA. We together developed this program, and especially Marcella, who did so much work in this. So thank you to all of you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anuj, and thank you for the overview of the NAMEPA's Maritime Sustainability Passport Program, which is free to our members. Otherwise, the charge happens to be exactly the same as the membership, so come on board. Anuj, just a quick question before you go. What do you feel are the barriers to companies embracing ESG? And do you feel that today's tools are adequately supporting the industry? I mean, are we properly assessing companies today?
Great question, Carleen. Thank you. So many companies want to get on the ESG journey, but they have a challenge. For the maritime supply chain, there is no standard metric available out there. There are organizations which look at the financial side of it, which look at other industries, but there is nothing being targeted specifically to maritime. Perhaps NAMEPA is the only program which gives a clear path at this time, which looks at it. There are some others, but they only look at financial reporting, but they're not looking at social, they're not looking at governance, they're not looking at environment. And like I said, it's not about, we're not talking about minimum compliance or what we say regulatory compliance. We're looking at best management practices. We want good actors to take this forward. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much, Anuj. Our next presenter is Lieutenant Andrew Baranski, who graduated from Kings Point, then he sailed, and he's now returned to his alma mater in order to support their efforts on inclusion and diversity. Andrew is going to share with us strategies for identifying and executing strategies for opening corporate cultures to be more inclusive. Andrew, we are eagerly awaiting your suggestions.
I don't get that. Good morning, Carleen. Thank you for that kind introduction. I've spent the last 4 years at the United States Merchant Marine Academy. I actually just transitioned this month to the NYU Stern School of Business, where I'm an MBA candidate. But I've really had a unique opportunity to work with the next generation of mariners and educate the next generation of mariners who are at the tip of the spear. When you talk about social changes in industries around the world, it's this new generation coming up that are really demanding these social changes take place. So I reached back to my students to kick off this presentation, asked them, what topics do you think of when you think of the social aspect of the maritime industry? And I took their answers and I made a word cloud out of it. For those not familiar with the word cloud, it takes the most popular answers, makes them larger, and the less popular answers smaller. Next slide, please. And this is what I got. As you can see, there's a large variety of answers that came in, but at the forefront, it was diversity, inclusion, family, communication, community, network, respect, health. All these answers tie together in a form. So I looked at this data and I said, okay, how do I distill this down? What connects every single point that my students raised? And I said culture. They're talking about culture. So when you talk about supporting the social aspect of the maritime industry, you're talking about building a healthy culture. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the heart of this presentation, I want to establish a baseline and come to a common understanding of what is a healthy work culture. A healthy work culture is one that allows everyone to thrive regardless of race, religion, creed, ethnicity, and everything else listed on this slide. It's one that promotes personal well-being. It's one that provides opportunities for employees to grow and develop professionally. And lastly, and probably most importantly, a healthy work culture brings diverse viewpoints and opinions into daily operations and decision-making and respects these diverse viewpoints. That respect piece is key. If you hit on all four of these consistently, you have a healthy work culture. Next slide, please. Now, the maritime industry is unique, and there are specific challenges that exist that are obstacles in fostering a diverse, inclusive, and therefore healthy culture within the maritime industry. And those obstacles and barriers are, first and foremost, we are different from any other industry in the world. There is no template we can follow. We can't look at consulting, we can't look at banking, we can't look at any other industry and say, okay, what worked in the technology field, copy, paste. No, we have to forge our own path forward. In the maritime industry, when you're a mariner on the ship, there are no days off. And if your coworkers are driving you crazy, they're driving you crazy. You have to show up to work the next day. There's no, I'm taking a week off, I'm taking a weekend, I'm taking a sick day. There is none of that. Secondly, mariners are in a closed environment. When they step on the ship, the 20 people that are on their ship are with them for the next 3 to 4 months. There is no interaction with the outside. And third, and this is becoming increasingly more important as we dive into the future, mariners are isolated from family and friends. And in a world that's becoming more and more socially connected, this is playing a larger role in the mental health of our mariners. Second, there is difficulty in oversight and lack of direct involvement from corporate office in the daily operations of commercial vessels. So while companies are coming out with zero tolerance policies, which is great, every ship is still maintaining its own culture, which is dictated by who's on board at that time. And because of this, it's hard to standardize a culture across a fleet of vessels. And lastly, there is difficulty in developing the softer skills of leadership. Ships don't stop moving. The operation must continue. And because of that, we're seeing a lack in training time and mariners receiving the proper training. Therefore, they're not developing skills in dialoguing, and they're having difficulty developing the ability to appreciate differing vantage points and perspectives and backgrounds. Next slide, please. Second, I want to talk about the structure of the United States maritime industry. And I want to pose the question, is the current industry setup conducive to fostering racial equality? So to begin delving into this, I said, okay, well, what's the demographics of our officer population and what's the demographics of our unlicensed population? So I reached out to the Maritime Administration and the United States Coast Guard, and I was pretty surprised to find out that neither one of these entities track racial demographics between the officer population and unlicensed population. So I will tell you from my experience, the primarily officers are white and the unlicensed mariners are people of color. So I said, okay, well, what's causing this lack in diversity, particularly among the managers on board ships, which is the licensed population? Most licensed mariners come from collegiate licensing programs. So I took a look at our schools and I said, okay, well, what's the diversity amongst our school population who are pumping out these licensed mariners? And as you will see, Maine Maritime is 85% white. SUNY Maritime is 67% white. The United States Merchant Marine Academy is 80% white. And I can tell you the other schools are not listed on here, but they follow a similar track. So we can see that our schools face a serious issue in diversity. So to answer the question, I'm going to say no, we're not really set up for racial equality amongst our populations of officer and unlicensed. Next slide, please. So diving into the culture aspect, what are the negative impacts of a negative culture? What are the impacts of a negative culture in our industry? First and foremost, you have the current crewing crisis that's playing out right now. And particularly in inland waterways, we're seeing a lack of retention in qualified mariners. They're talking about the deckhands right now, but I see this playing out into the rest of our sector where more and more mariners don't want to ship out and sail anymore because they're facing a negative culture. Second, you're seeing needless lawsuits caused by misunderstandings. The amount of situations that I witnessed both while on the ship and now as a program manager at the Merchant Marine Academy, the amount of issues that should have been diffused at the lower level and weren't, that raised all the way to the point of a lawsuit, is ridiculous. Companies are spending exorbitant amounts of money on things that should be diffused on board the vessels. Third, in a negative culture, people don't bring their authentic selves to work. This is causing a lack of innovation, a lack of diverse ideas, and it's causing undue mental stress for those who feel different from the cultural normative. And lastly, mariners don't have the opportunity to grow professionally and face difficulty reintegrating when they return home on leave. They're not being challenged socially, they're not being challenged emotionally, and when they return home, they feel irrelevant because they're having difficulty connecting. That's not fair to our mariners who ship out 6 to 9 months out of the year. Next slide, please. Now that we talked about the negative aspects, let's talk about the positive impacts of a healthy work culture. Why bother tackling this issue? First, a healthy work culture cuts costs. In a healthy work culture, you'll have fewer grievances, fewer lawsuits, and you'll have the retention of valuable employees. It costs money to rehire people, retrain, reorientate. That all costs money that should not be spent if you just retain the valuable employees that you have. Additionally, a McKinsey study completed in 2019 found that companies in the top quartile of racial and cultural diversity among its executives outperformed those in the bottom quartile by 36% in profitability. 36% is a huge number. And when we talk about executives, I'm talking about onshore, on-ship managers as well. That's why that diversity piece amongst the officer population is important. And lastly, a healthy work culture will lead to the development of cultured leaders who can be the next generation of shoreside managers that are forward-thinking and able to lead the industry through disruptions and challenges of the future. As everyone on this call is aware, we have massive disruption that will be facing our industry over the next 10 years. Between green technology, autonomous technology, and cybersecurity, we need forward-thinking leaders who understand the maritime industry at its grassroots level, but can also dialogue across different industries and diverse backgrounds of people to successfully lead the maritime sector into the future. Next slide, please. The path forward. So what can we do today to build a stronger industry for tomorrow? First and foremost, education. Education will be the key to empowering mariners to create positive culture changes. We need to develop a robust education program that fosters diversity and inclusion through dialogue. This doesn't need to be any extravagant, big initiative. This can just be small but consistent trainings carried out by competent professionals. When I say competent professionals, this cannot be a collateral duty of the captain, chief mate, or somebody already on board the vessel. This needs to be a third-party entity who comes in and is professionally trained in mediating and facilitating these difficult conversations that lead to the development of the softer skills of leadership. Second, we need to create communities within the maritime industry. If you look around the border of this slide, so many companies have taken aggressive steps to build business resource groups to all their diverse employees. Amazon, McKinsey, Bain, Pfizer, Comcast, Home Depot, JP Morgan, these are all massive companies. If you search the maritime industry for a business resource group, you won't find any. That's an issue. And I do have to give a shout out to NAMEPA and CMA for having this conversation today and starting the conversation. This is a big step forward, but we need to do more. BRGs will create the signage and awareness that's necessary. Third, promote equality. Diversity-driven scholarships in our schools to help promote that diversity piece, outreach to charter schools to promote diversity. And I want to pitch the idea of corporate-run paths to obtaining license. How do we develop the unlicensed population and guide them in the path of obtaining their license? As a licensed officer, I helped probably 20 mariners in studying for the license exams while they were working as an AB or an OS. Unfortunately, of those 20, not one single one of them made it to being a licensed officer. That's an issue. So we need to create that pathway and have that opportunity for them. Fourth, the last thing that we need to do is we need to improve the quality of life on board ships. Ships are where mariners live for 6 to 9 months out of the year. That is their home. We need to encourage and support healthy lifestyles, improve communication ability, provide mental health resources. If nothing else learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, we learned that our mariners were already walking a fine line between having a mental health balance and being able to effectively do their job. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated this, and really mariners struggled only to find out there were no resources available to them to help them through this struggle. And lastly, invest in the onboard facilities for mariners. With that, I close out this presentation. I thank NAMEPA and the CMA for having me here today. It was an absolute pleasure to be on this panel. And thank you to all the viewers who tuned in to speak about this important topic.
Oh, Andrew, thank you so much. And you gave us almost a fire hose worth of information about the state of our industry as well as what we could be doing moving forward. But if you had to pick one thing, just one action item that would get companies on the path to greater inclusion and diversity, what would that one thing be?
It would be the education piece. The education piece will be huge to moving our industry towards progress. The more educated and socially aware our managers are, especially from the top down, the more productive they will be on board their ships, and that will have outreach to the entire sector. Education is the key forward.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Now we're going to hear from Cynthia Hudson, who's the founder and CEO of Hudson Analytics, which has within its extensive framework of service offerings, Hudson Cyber. Every day we are seeing the impact of cybersecurity, and maritime is no exception. The issue of cybersecurity is becoming one of the most important governance topics in board meetings around the globe. Cynthia is going to provide us with guidance on cyber risk governance. Cynthia, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you for setting up such a wonderful seminar to really focus our thoughts on ESG. It's exactly the right time and exactly the right thing. I wanted to connect cyber, and after hearing the great presentations of Jeff, Anuj, and Andrew, I felt that it's interesting to take, as I think Andrew did, one particular point that is a facet of ESG and show you how it develops. And the point that I'm stressing, of course, is going to be cyber risk management. Next slide, please. This is just a little bit about us. Oh, Cecilia, next slide, please. There we are. So this is a little bit about us and what we do. And it's interesting for me, after all these years, to see that the elements of our company really do match up to many of the areas that are of concern in the ESG program. And I'd like to show you a little bit about how that all interconnects. But let me go forward and show you what Hudson Cyber does. Next slide, please. Next, what we are doing is taking the elements of cyber risk and trying to say, what does a shipping company need? And it may not be able to do itself. It may have a very good cyber team internally, but perhaps not. And so big companies as well as mid-sized companies need to be able to face that risk. We're here to support that. Next slide, please. So ESG, and I like this title, What's Cybersecurity Got to Do with It? Perhaps because I remember that old Tina Turner song, but I think that it is not intuitive. People think of cybersecurity as a standalone, perhaps in its own silo. And yet the interconnections are big and dramatic. It really is a necessity to think about ESG in looking at each of the facets and saying, how are we sustaining a business that does the right thing for the right reason? On the cyber side, it's clear that protection of your information, data, and communications is going to be key. But, you know, protection of your personnel, their property, your business policies and procedures are really another facet. Cyber is the place where those things can be at risk. The other thing I wanted to point out, and I think that Anuj did this very, very well, is that this has to be holistic. It has to be, yes, the vessels and the operations and crew aboard the vessels. It has to be the equipment, but it also has to be all the way up to top management and board of directors, which are integrating in their approach to perform for the environment, for our social precepts, and the governance needs to be in place to do that. Next slide, please. So cyber risk. I just want to connect cyber both to environment and to social. It looks to us like cyber doesn't have much connection, although you do hear the occasional question, if a cyber breach occurs, does that mean someone could take over your vessel and ram it into a pier and create, or another vessel and create an oil spill? Well, yes, that's possible. Is it probable? We don't think so. But we think that the fact is that any way that information may be compromised can lead to a negative incident, a big one or a small one. You know, we've seen recently in the Colonial Pipeline situation, the intrusion of nefarious individuals to manipulate data, yes, for ransomware, but with regard to the infrastructure, we believe that the next conversation, and in fact, you can see this on the internet right now, is perhaps the willingness of the next wave of hackers to hold us hostage from a cyber incident that could impact our environment. You see here, for example, a flood that could be conceivably created by the interference with the systems that control locks and dams. That's just a small example, but the issue is money and ransomware. It's also nation state actors who can come in and say, all right, we know that the environment needs to be protected and we know people will pay for that. So what we're saying is cyber connects to this, not just in the simplistic way of can we take over a vessel control, but also in a quite complicated way if people are willing to move forward with the interference with our infrastructure. Next slide, please. Cyber also has an intersection with a social compact. I think it's very clear from what Andrew was talking about how this really works with regard to our staff, our colleagues, and our crew aboard vessels. But it also has to do with the wider elements of social compact. So when we're talking about data privacy, and we're talking about security, and we're talking about appropriate consent, every vessel owner that I know has a large circle of interaction, whether it be vendors or it be organizations like NAMEPA in which we're involved. We have a very wide circle of influence, but we also have data on all those people. We also have email addresses. We also have discoverable information when it comes to a bad actor trying to take information from us. Look, we need to protect this information, and it is at risk in a cyber situation. Our customers have to be satisfied that, in fact, we are doing just that. Do we want to, as an outside customer, do we want to have people that we are working with in a business interaction to not protect the data about our contract, for example, or the financial elements of that contract? Of course not. There's much more to this. Please go to the next slide for me. So cybersecurity is really at the crossroads of ESG governance. And what I mean by that is that the issues that were raised so eloquently by Jeff, which involve business ethics, integrity, we have to remember that doing these things is important, but protecting what we are doing and making sure that these policies and procedures are not at risk with regard to a cyber incident is absolutely top priority. Accountability and oversight is another element. And I think Anuj mentioned that, you know, you can't really, if you can't measure, you can't monitor, you can't improve. But if we want to take our entire program and put it in a way that is not what we are planning out into the public eye for some reason, then we better be thinking about managing the risk that comes from cybersecurity. So the question about every single issue that occurs within a business is, how does the board of directors manage that risk? And then how does the board of directors manage cyber risk? Please, next slide. So what we are saying is we want to have a sustainable business. And that includes the operations aboard the vessel. It includes the operations in our actual business environment. And that leads us to knowing that we have to manage the cyber risks appropriately. What are the perils of not doing so? The risk will affect all of these key facets, all the stakeholders, including our vendors, including our suppliers, including the people who are depending on our business for their living. It will affect our business partners, our financial partners, our employees. The bottom line is something that is still extremely important. Because we're working within ESG, we don't stop talking about the bottom line. We are trying to say the bottom line will be enhanced and protected if we can put in the right sorts of policies and procedures and hold people accountable. Next slide, please. Appropriate levels of cyber governance needs to be identified. How do we do that? Well, we look at what's at risk. We look at what are the financial implications of not doing so. The board of directors now, through ESG, has an extremely clear obligation to make security absolutely as good as it can be and to identify the governance and risk oversight boards. Governance takes many different areas. Who will be appointed to oversee it? Specifically who? Who is going to cobble together the mitigation actions? Specifically, this doesn't only apply to cyber, but it does apply to cyber. Cyber risk has a seat at the table when looking at ESG, because we know that cyber and a really serious incident has the ability, through a breach or even an incident that no one is aware of, an intrusion into your systems, it has the ability to destroy the things that you've been building up. The board of directors has to be engaged and cannot just cede that responsibility to senior management. Senior management has to be thinking about this every day. And on that list of things they're thinking about must be cyber risk management. Next slide, please. So why does this make anything important to us right now? Well, we've said about cyber many, many times. It's capital intensive, from new buildings to the vessel trading to scrapping to all of the purchases for every single thing we do. Capital, money is moving. And so this makes us an attractive target. The scale of threat to the systems, we have lots of information flying around, which can be compromised or masked. We have legacy systems. We have language differences. This means that from a perspective of taking the normal complexity of our business and taking that to an advantage for a hacker is something that would be attractive. Cyber risk needs to be related, and I mentioned this just a little earlier, it has to be related to the financial implications. So when we're taking a board activity, we have to say, all right, holistically, what does our business have at risk on the cyber side? And what are the financial implications if we unfortunately have a compromise? I'd just like to point to some recent major attacks. Please look them up and see what has happened here. I've added a couple of ports because I think that we are maybe stovepiped on the shipping side and forget that we are interacting and interfacing with ports. We can introduce threats and intrusions to ports, and ports may unfortunately also introduce those threats to us. So it's really going to be a thought process of our entire supply chain. But look at the ECU worldwide, which is all cargo logistics, the ransomware attack. It's, I would say, eye-opening. And we've seen some other ransomware attacks, even recently, to do with the Martha's Ferry Vineyard ferry attack last week. It should tell you that we are definitely on the hackers' radar. I don't have to mention that our OT systems are vulnerable. I think we all know that. we also have to understand that there's roughly in 2019 a 900% increase, according to some, in the maritime industry's operational technology systems attacks. So this is something that should be on our radar. Next slide, please. So ESG really requires oversight. It requires us to understand what our appropriate levels of cyber risk are. Does your company right now have an integrated strategy? You have maybe an ESG strategy. Is cyber a component of that? Have you started to implement? Do you have accountability and oversight? Are you able to provide evidence? Evidence means not only the participation in valuable organizations like NAMEPA, but the NAMEPA passport, which says you've passed criteria. Do you have a cyber element of that? Do you know where you stand next to the cyber maturity model? Do you understand what your next steps are and how you're taking them? Can you show a third party, perhaps a financial investor? Could you show it if there's a breach that damages a third party? Can you continuously manage, measure, and monitor? Next slide, please. So this is what I would say is the win. This is, as you've heard from many of the speakers today, doing well by doing good. There is a competitive advantage in doing so, but we are doing the right things for the right reasons. We expect this to deliver an improved and sustainable bottom line. Sustainable, to my way of thinking, and perhaps this is simplistic, is I'm doing a good job now, but do I have a plan for doing that same good job and even a better job in the future? Am I going to be around doing well in 3 years and 5 years? What's my plan for doing so? And so that means controlling the future of your business. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today on this important subject.
Oh, thank you very much, Cynthia. Great overview and a great opportunity for us to bring this issue to the fore. It's not just the headlines, it's in our own offices. And to that end, from the boardroom to the engine room, how deep should cyber training go?
That's an excellent question. Certainly, the seafarer needs to have adequate training to understand how he can contribute and how he does possibly pose a risk to his vessel and also his company. But you know, we can't place this on the shoulders of the officers and crew of the ship without having this deep understanding of what it means to the actual vessel owner and his structure. I mean, when you're talking about management, you're talking about the operations side, you're talking about the chartering side of the best companies. I think you'd be surprised to learn what little is done. And I think it was Jeff that said, you know, we can't just be seen to look green. We have to actually do this. We have to actually jump in with both hands and make sure that training is top to bottom, side to side, and includes the appropriate levels of information for each of the job responsibilities that are affected.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to all our presenters today, and also to the CMA for their partnership in putting this event on. Now we're going to turn back to Paul Mazzulli, who will lead the Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Carleen. I wanted to start off actually with one of my own questions. Just hearing all this, and it's triggered something that I've been thinking about for a couple of days. But we've already seen and discussed engine number one with Exxon, and we've talked about Shell's diversification or divestment in their assets in Deer Park and in Saraland. When you're looking into those transactions as your own company, how deep do you look? I mean, for example, if somebody sells a refinery, but they keep the supply agreements and they keep the offtake agreements, they're really just sort of greenwashing. They're erasing their name from the liability of the operating plant, but they're still probably getting the profits and the revenue from it. So, to what extent do you think we can avoid the platitudes of the "yay, we care a lot," kind of statements, and ensure that the companies are being audited and there's actually some substance behind the statements? And I'll throw that out to anyone who wants to start. Yeah, Jeff, it looks like you might have an answer there.
Well, I think it's going to come from the market in part. The providers of capital, just to take that one stakeholder or group that I'm most familiar with, are increasingly not going to be satisfied with what's greenwashing or just ineffectual changes, such as one example you gave. So they want to see actual reduction in greenhouse gases or progress in other areas that are monitored. So I think at least part of I'm sure there's a regulatory part of this, and maybe someone else could speak to that, but I just want to say at least part of the enforcement, so to speak, is coming from the market. And I'll give you one more example I wanted to say during my remarks. We used to talk 2 years ago about, oh, well, maybe the companies that are most ESG focused will, and truly ESG focused with a good strategy, will get better access to capital, and maybe that'll be less expensive than an advantage. Well, it works out to be the same way. It's an advantage, but kind of turned around a little bit. I think if you're a company and you're not focused on genuine ESG and sustainability principles, and only doing kind of greenwashing actions and just talk, like you mentioned, you will find that you'll have especially in shipping, which already is not always the easiest industry to fund, close to the funding are generally shrinking. You're going to find it harder and harder to get the capital, and they'll have to pay more for it. So I think there's a market discipline that's going to enforce honest ESG principles.
Excellent. Does anyone else have some thoughts on that in terms of what the liability might be, or what the, I guess the tolerance for puffing as opposed to actual action? Does anyone have any examples, perhaps, of seeing somebody come up a little bit short on their claims versus their performance?
A great point, Paul. And just to highlight, this is being increasingly targeted in Europe and in EU. And I think we're seeing now new regulations come in where they're asking for transparency. So just as an example, we're seeing companies to show diversity and inclusion, to show as a total company where they have the diversity point only at a lower level to match the numbers, but it doesn't look throughout the stratification of the company, like at the board level, senior management level, and that sort of stuff. So there is increased focus in this, and the standards are looking at it very closely. So yes, companies started it as a marketing exercise, greenwashing popularly known, but that is changing. And as you saw in the EU headline from there, that the screws are tightening on this one.
Excellent. Yes, here. Yes.
Wait, Paul, one more point, maybe just jumping back in, following up on the news. A good example outside of the environmental and the governance side of things, likely we will see from either states or the SEC or NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange. The NASDAQ's already started this, a requirement for diversity on boards that are listed on either listed on the NASDAQ in that case, or doing business in California or registered in California. Depends on the jurisdiction of the regulator, but to have racial diversity as part of the boardroom. And ironically, my understanding is that only a couple of years ago, it was taboo to list, it was difficult anyway to disclose ethnic or racial diversity in SEC funds, which was a well-meaning intent to avoid discrimination. And now we're shifting around to where at least self-identified minorities, racial minorities, will become an important feature for the governance side of our ESG going forward, and that's going to be enforced. No greenwashing around that.
Right. And pretty easy to discover as well, since everybody's got to have their photograph up on the website for the management team and the boards. So you can't really hide, or if you try to, you'll get in even more trouble with, I know, various attempts at people shading things, for lack of a better word. So I guess I'm not sure, and I'm probably almost certain, Jeff, that you can't really discuss this too much since the transaction's pending. But I would think that any acquisitions, hypothetically, in the business, when you're looking at taking over another company, their profile has become a lot more of concern rather than just looking at the finances, but you have to look at the ESG makeup of the company as well. And it might be a deterrent, or at least a concern, if you're taking over or if you're acquiring a privately held or privately controlled fleet. What does that mean in terms of the ability to do a corporate buyout or a transaction of another firm if they're privately held and, let's say, not as accountable for this stuff? Would that become possibly a deterrent to expansion for owners or asset operators?
It could. I think, fortunately for us in shipping, the acquisitions of a fleet sometimes are just assets only, and there are people who and assets in corporate acquisitions, such as the one we're doing with M&S. The size of the organization on land is small enough that we could identify that we have very similar, fortunately, very similar views towards the values around ESG, and the corporate cultures were aligned. We don't see it. You're right. We had to evaluate whether there was any threat to our leading position in ESG in our industry, and we would be able to keep that culture going. And we judged that we could. I think it would be more challenging in bigger organizations where there's thousands and thousands of people and lots of corporate culture, includes many offices. But so I would say we're a little fortunate, but I think if we take the Vanessa acquisition as an example, we're very comfortable that this other New York area-based Western style transparent company very much aligned with us in governance and more parts of the ESG. So yes, a concern. We check the Vanessa, we check the box.
Excellent. Now, I'm not sure if Cecilia can pipe in here, but have there been any other questions? I can't quite tell if anybody else has posted questions among the audience or among the participants here. Or Carlene, if you can tell me if anybody else has questions. If not, I had one more that I might throw out there, but I don't want to hog the space and give other people the chance to participate if anybody has their hand raised. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Yeah.
Yes. So are there any other questions out there, Carlene?
No.
Okay. I might just throw one out to Ms. Hudson, who I haven't seen in forever, and good to see you here. Just even a month and a half ago, nobody would have thought about something like the Colonial Pipeline hack. What do you see as the percentage chance, roughly, of vessels being hacked while they're approaching New York Harbor or New Haven or something like that, and having somebody remotely infiltrate a vessel and potentially cause damage? I'm thinking speed 2 cruise control kind of approach to infrastructure damage there. Do you think that's a real concern, or is that just something Hollywood makes up?
Well, let me say that hacking or intrusion into vessel systems is happening worldwide every day. And we don't know, let's just say the preponderance of these attacks are not reported. People sometimes don't report them because they don't discover them. I think it's about 180 days is a normal time lag between an intrusion and the discovery of that intrusion. Whether the discovery is made by a consequence that has occurred that is visible, or the discovery is made in routine security checking of the systems. So this is here right now. There have been a variety of incidents. Fortunately, we are unsure. There's some talk, and I don't want to add to a rumor mill about this, but there's some talk about the unfortunate incident in the Suez having had a cyber component. I couldn't verify that. I don't know, but the talk is rather, let's say, deeply rooted in why that might be able to be a situation. So, you know, our Coast Guard is very, very well aware of this, as are other countries. The European Union through ENISA is aware of this and are trying to take steps to be ready for these types of events. But commensurately, the vessel owner has to understand that this is not science fiction. This is the present day we live in. And if a colonial pipeline can take place, or if a Martha's Vineyard ferry intrusion can take place, then we are vulnerable. And we've got to sort of do better than outrun and manage the risk, because the people that are trying to get in have all the time in the world. They share information, they are persistent, and the rewards are huge for the little amount of time they have to put into getting there. So, you know, I think 5 years ago, people were saying cyber what? And now people are saying, I have to get with it. I think most people don't know where to start, but because of your question, I think if people's consciousness can be raised and say, all right, I don't know where to start, I'm going to call somebody and find out, that would be a wonderful thing.
Got it. And just one last one for Joe. Is that something that's insurable? Can you, to your knowledge, your experience, can you get an insurance policy against a cyber attack like Colonial Pipeline had?
Well, it depends which area of insurance you're talking about. I mean, generally speaking, so far as protection and indemnity cover from the international group mutual clubs is concerned, there is no general exclusion of cover for the consequences of a cyber incident, except where that cyber incident is deemed to have been an act of war or a terrorist act. So malicious cyber or accidental cyber would be covered in the ordinary way, actually. Now, the landscape is changing a bit on this, as you might imagine, and there is within the market, the marine market in general. I mean, hull and machinery and all the rest of it is different. I mean, there are cyber exclusions, generally speaking, in regard to the property risk element of marine insurance in this context. The landscape is changing, even for the manner in which the group clubs themselves may be arranging their own reinsurances over the next year or so. But generally speaking, as a matter of principle, yes, that this sort of thing, barring the circumstances where that would deem to be a war or terrorism risk, would be covered. I haven't heard, I must say, actually, Cynthia, about any suggestion that the Ever Given was cyber related. The main liabilities on that, of course, are covered by one of our co-venturer clubs within the international group, the UK club, and they haven't mentioned that to the group at the moment. So I think that's probably a rumor at the present time, but it's an interesting one.
Always.
Thank you, Joe. I can add that we have no validation that was the cause either. And so again, no rumor mill, but just the size and scope of what could be done is I think a really important issue to contemplate.
Indeed, marine underwriters are very well aware of this as an issue, and it's never been higher up the agenda of marine underwriters' concerns than it is now.
Thank you.
Excellent. I think that probably takes us out in terms of time, unless there's something that Carleen wants to add. It looks like we're even a few minutes over, which is my apology for taking up the extra time. I'm sure everybody has places to go. But I will leave it to our hostess to close things out here and thank everybody for my ability to participate, speaking personally, and of course, NAMEPA, and happy World Ocean Day to everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And we are just really honored and pleased that the CMA and NAMEPA have been able to partner today, and more importantly, to bring such an important program to the maritime industry. We are all in this together, and it's important for us to create partnerships like this and collaborations like this to help the planet, help our industry, and importantly, help the mariners do the best job they possibly can. Joe, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, no, other than to say, I'm sure everybody will agree this was an absolutely fascinating session. And I'm sure that we all learned a great deal from such a wide range of different perspectives about this very, very important issue, and how, the different elements of it can be embraced for the future, because it's staying with us. I mean, ESG is very, very much part of the future, and that future clearly is already in sight. So everybody's got to concentrate their efforts on it, I think. And we're delighted equally from our perspective, the NAMEPA, American Club, and all the rest of it, in being allowed to participate in this. Thank you to everybody involved.
Good day, then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.